Today's a nicer day, so I'm working outdoors. Temperature's right, the wind's not bad. One of the things I'm doing is continuing to clean parts. The more and more that you work on paint, cleanliness is kind of the main thing. And I cleaned them once, so they've been cleaned with a heavy-duty detergent and soap and water scrubbed down. They've been cleaned with solvent, with a paint prep solvent. I'm cleaning them with Windex, with a glass cleaner with ammonia in it also. And then I'm going to come back one more time with some solvent. I've done some of the spot repair, but I'm getting pretty close. I have a few more spot repairs, but I had cleaned very carefully where I was doing those repairs, but now I need to clean the whole part because it's time to, I'm going to start scuffing it with 400 grit and getting it prepped for color and or a few more repairs that I need to make.
So while I was working outside, I realized I didn't take video of all the work I was doing. But at this stage, as I mentioned, the parts need to be deglossed and scuffed everywhere. So after I cleaned, I went over these parts with the orbital sander with a 400 grit disc that's perforated and is very good for removing material. I went over different spots with 320 and or 400 depending on where I was, and sanded the parts again in different places where the orbital wouldn't reach. And then I used a maroon Scotch-Brite pad, which is again supposed to be in the neighborhood of a 400, and used that in places where I couldn't get with flat sandpaper. So all three of the parts that you see in the picture have been thoroughly deglossed, and additional sanding has been done.
Well, I brought my parts in for the night. I spent most of the day outdoors, and my intention was that I was going to just do a little bit of blending here and there and do the 400 grit and rough things up a little. But you'll see there's some spots here, like this one, that when I got down closer and looked at it, there were cracks in the paint. Probably because this is the chin spoiler, and it got probably got bumped at some point. So, and the same thing's true over here in the middle. So there are a number of places here where I've had to go and take it back down to the base material. Most of them have not had cracks all the way down into the plastic. By the time they get down to the bottom, they seem like they're clear. But I got a couple spots I'm going to need to look a little bit harder at, probably in the morning. And but in general, things are cleaning up. It's just every place I go where I find a flaw. There were a couple here in the back bumper where things had rubbed up against, and so I'm trying to blend them out. And some of these I'll have to prime. The ones that are, particularly the ones that are through down to the base material, I'll have to prime for sure. This corner had some cracks too. So, but at this point, I'm about 90% finished with getting them going across them with 400. It's been a combination of using the electric sander with a 400 grit disc on it, using the 400-ish Scotch-Brite pad. I've only actually needed one, and block sanding in places and with 400 paper. So just working my way around it now, and yeah, pretty good day's work. Boy, you'd think it could go faster than this, but it doesn't seem like it likes to, so I'm taking the time to make sure that I get the flaws out so that it looks nice. I got the boat out of this stall so that I've got more working room, and this is where I intend to set up and do my painting. I've got some work to do to set up my booth, so looks good for a day's worth of work. I'm going to hit it again in the morning and see if I can finish the flaws and get things primed. I've been over these parts now, almost all over. It's still a few glossy spots I need to go finish up, but they've basically been done with 400 grit so that I could paint over the paint without primer. But the places where I went down to base material, right now they're sanded with 400, or I should be careful. I'm trying to follow the service manual's recommendation on these flexible parts because it's different from my experience working on steel parts. These are polyurethane, and so it's a different animal. So I've been using 150. I think they said 180, but something in that range to get through the paint, get down to the base material when I'm grinding out the cracks. If I need to put the two-part adhesive, the 3M structural adhesive on, they want that prepped with like 50 grit, which I've also done. And right now what I'm trying to do is, so this has all been done with 150 to get down, and it in most cases has had some 400 smoothing the edges and things. But what they recommend before you prime on this surface is to use 320. So I'm just going to go around here and I'm going to sand these with 320, and I'm taking a really hard extra look to make sure that there aren't cracks in the plastic that I have to deal with. Now, a fresh bit of 320, let's see how this works. Because what I'm kind of just looking for is whether or not there are any remaining hairline cracks or whether I got through everything. That one looks pretty doggone clear. I don't see anything down into the plastic. Rough that up just a little bit. So both of those look pretty good. I don't see any cracking in there. And if you're not careful how you go with the sandpaper puts little lines in it. Well, I'm just going to go around now and go to each one of my spots and make a decision on it. And then it won't be too long, and I ought to be able to start hitting this with some primer. And then come back and sand them out and smooth them. Well, here's the lower called chin spoiler. Most of the areas I've been around now, getting through the paint down to the base material has removed all the cracks. But in this particular one over on this side, this is the left-hand side, I don't know how visible that is. We're going to try to get in closer, but see if I can get it to focus here. But in this area, there are a number of cracks, and they kind of go, or they look like scratch marks that go through that section. So far sanding them, I haven't been able to get through them. So I think I'm going to have to treat them as cracks, but there are so many. There's kind of a little forest of them here. I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's like half a dozen. There's a section through here. I don't want to grind that too deep and take too much strength out of the part, but what I think I'm going to come in and hit that area with a coarse disc, and then come back and put a thin, relatively thin coat, just enough to level it up, of the structural adhesive. That stuff's pretty doggone tough. So if I can rough the surface enough to give it something to bite on, perhaps that's enough to keep those cracks. I don't know how deep they go, And I'm a little reluctant to try to grind all the way to the bottom of them, but well, I'm going to get out my my coarser disc and see what I can do in that area, and then try to level them up with structural adhesive and blend it in. And I don't happen to have a 50, but I have an 80, so I'm going to try to work this out with an 80, and then I've got some 40 that I can, in a sheet that I can use to hand sand, so I think I'll be okay. But let's see if we can. Well, that looks better. At this stage, I don't see the cracks any longer. I think I got underneath them. I mean, it's kind of coarse to see, but okay. I'm going to rough that with some 40, and then I'm going to mix a batch of adhesive and run across there with it, and see if I can get that blended in. Well, and actually, I did find a 40 grit. I had a 40 grit, and I've got a 120. I'm going to widen this edge back a little bit. Okay, good. I'm going to mix up a batch of the adhesive here. See how much I need. I've got clean. This doesn't look clean. I just flipped it over to the other side, but I have a clean surface. So we'll get a. I'm going to try to mix a little larger batch. Make sure I got enough to cover. About the same length. And then I'll use a little paddle here. We'll mix it up. And the thing you got to do with this stuff is you've got to be fast, because they tell you you only have about a 2-minute working time, and heck, you can spend that much mixing it properly. So apparently after 2 minutes the bond strength is lower, so even if you can move it, you want to get it on fast. Start with that. Use the wider one to blend with here. Got a few divots in that. Don't like that. There we go. That's a little better. Smooth if I can. This material is it's very rubbery, and it's fairly hard to work. You got to really let it settle in before. Blend her down here a little bit. What I can do to make the job a little easier. All right. Try to make sure I got the divots filled in. That's about all the messing around I can do with it. It's going to be... Well, it's been setting up for a little while. This stuff gets really rubbery, so I may not be able to cut much with it, but I'm going to try a little bit with one of my cheese grater style files here and just try to get some of the high spots knocked off. It's still a little soft, doesn't really want to do a lot of cutting yet, but knock off what we can. I really like using these partially rounded ones when you're trying to do this kind of work, because if you've got a flat surface, you know, using one of the flat ones is nice, but when the nice thing with this is it's stiff all by itself, and so it kind of lets me follow the contour better. And the goal right now for me is just to kind of get the high spots down. And if there's anything that's way too low, I may need to mix another batch and just fill in pinholes. But so far, it's not too bad. It's getting pretty close. I don't want to go too far, because I want to have some left. I need to be able to sand it and smooth it, so. Alright, I think that's as far as I'm going to go for now. We'll let that harden up a little bit more because it's really too soft to sand yet. And I'll come back and work on that in a bit. Well, so after it gets roughed in, the instructions are to use 220 on this to get it down close, and then 320 to finish it off and feather it in. So let's see how this goes here. Start to cut it okay. All right. Working on these curved parts is always a little bit more of a challenge. Now I'm going to get the orbital out here and see if I can blend this in just a little bit more. Got some more 220. And then I'll probably finish it off with 400 or some 320 on the block. I haven't decided, but let's see what we can do here. Well, my goal was for a light coat here, up the middle, skim coat. It feels pretty darn smooth. We do a little more blending with primer here, but I need to leave a little bit to protect, for strength. So I think that's pretty darn good. I'm going to start cleaning things up so I can prime it. Well, I've been working for quite a while here, getting close to priming all the spots one more time and finishing them off. And all the parts now are scuffed. All of the spots that needed to go down because they had cracks or blemishes have all been sanded out. Right now I'm using some glass cleaner and doing a wipe down on the parts to get the, sanding residue. It's mostly the red paint from scuffing them, and then I'll use some solvent on them. But I've spent quite a bit of my last couple of days just getting my Just getting my stall ready here. Getting my tarp up. There isn't a ton of masking to do, but some of these I just don't want places where there are exposed fasteners or brackets or whichever. I want to try to keep those cleaned up. It's just a neatness thing, I guess. I just don't like tons of overspray on the parts in places where the factory wouldn't have had overspray. Everything's been gone over with 400 or 320 or somewhere in there, depending on what part it is. I'll come back with a tack rag, of course, before I spray color. And depending on how the primer goes, I may have to sand some of that too. See how nicely it lays out, but I've got a few spots that I think I'll have to sand. One of the biggest challenges has been figuring out how to lay out the parts and support them so that I can get all the way around and underneath. I suppose if I was a professional, I'd have some kind of stand I could bolt it to. I'm just using sawhorses with some masking paper over them, and then I've kind of figured out where to set them so they're on a surface that doesn't have to be painted. And frankly, I think we've come pretty close. I think it's not bad. Probably the chin spoiler is probably among the toughest. And I think I've even found a way for that. So I'm going to let that water evaporate, let them dry, and then I'm going to come back and do some solvent on them. Well, I'm getting pretty close to painting. I've been doing a lot of prep work. It's one thing about this job is it's really tedious and slow, at least for me. I tend to be kind of perfectionist. I want to make sure it's really smooth, and I want to make sure it's all almost like glass, and that you can't tell that I did anything. That's always my goal. And I'm not a professional body person. I'm not a professional painter, just an amateur. So it takes me a while. I want to make sure you put all this work in. I want to make sure it turns out right. I was kind of planning to paint today because the weather was right. Actually, I wanted to paint yesterday, but I wasn't quite ready. This morning I could have done it. It's a 90-degree day now, but I could have done it before, say, 10 o'clock. Got up early, tried to get ready, still wasn't ready. So I spent today getting organized, finishing everything off, and with the goal that hopefully the weather tomorrow morning will be ready and I'll have everything laid out and ready to go. I have had a couple of challenges. One was that my spray cans, I'm using the Spray Max for primer, and frankly I made a mistake and I got a lot more overspray on my parts than I expected. Usually I'm pretty careful and I kind of try to mask off around them in such a way that you don't get a sharp edge that you have to sand down. And when I did this one, you know, I had it kind of taped with folded over masking tape and had it constrained. But then when you get to the other parts, you know, I was prepared to let it fan out a little bit more. But those Spray Max cans are adjustable, and I thought I had it turned down to a narrow spray, but I had it actually on a wider spray. And it did give me a lot more overspray than I expected. I can't see it right there, the rear bumpers here. And you know, I was trying to hit some fairly small spots and I ended up with, you know, this much primer. And the goal in this, I may have said this before, but the paint company and the service manual said, because this is urethane part underneath, they recommended this epoxy primer for the places where you had to go down to a urethane surface. And they recommended that you don't prime the whole part, that you just sand the paint with 400 grit and make sure it's all deglossed, and then apply paint over the top and only prime where you have to. And in the beginning, all I had for priming was the one part that was cracked, but then as I got into it, I found a number of places where the paint had cracks, and the only way to get rid of the crack is to sand down to the substrate, and in some cases the cracks actually went into the substrate and I had to do some work there. So it caused me more challenge. So to get a little bit more detail here, so at this stage I did go ahead and blend out and blend around, and this has turned out pretty well. You know, I've been smoothing it with usually with a combination of 220 and you know, sanding block, 220, 320, 400 for a finish, and it's really turned out pretty well at the primer stage. And I had one of those cracks down here that I had to repair, and again, it's turned out very nicely. Turning to the rear bumper, this was one that just had tons of, I was trying to get this back corner, which again had a crack in the paint, just in the paint, and here this corner had a crack in the paint and a couple of divots, which I was able to grind out and fill. But when I sprayed these, I got overspray in a large area, and it took me a long time between 400 grit, the orbital sander. I didn't want to leave all that grainy kind of stuff on there that hadn't flowed, so all that pretty much got sanded back off. I had this spot in the middle where that license plate bracket contacted. The one that, you know, this car doesn't have the normal license plate because it has the IROC-Z emblem up there, that custom one. And so the license plate bracket mounts down below here, and the plate goes this way, but it had been banging into here and into the paint. So I got those, they didn't go all the way to the substrate, so I just sanded them well and primed them and sanded the primer to smooth it out. Something you can't see real well, but you can see a couple of screw heads, a couple stainless steel screws. That license plate bracket attaches with 4 screws just going into the plastic. And that's one of the reasons why I think it flexed and then it let it bang into here. So you can't see, but what I did is took a piece of galvanized steel, essentially like furnace duct. It's from an old furnace duct actually. And I cut a piece that's 2 inches wide, makes a bend, and goes, let's see if I can show it. Makes a bend and goes up in here, and I've got stainless steel screws holding it in place. Let me see if I can get around the other side here. Probably a little bit dark, but right there you can see a piece of sheet steel bent to follow the contours. I just want to try to add some stiffness. So the sheet metal goes across the bottom here and then makes the bend here. And so I tied it in both places, and that just adds a little bit of bending stiffness there. And then I drilled the 4 holes, so when I go to put the license plate bracket back on, it'll screw into that piece of sheet metal, and hopefully that'll reduce the springiness of that bracket. And this section is all smoothed out. It's where the tune port injection badge goes, and when I pulled the adhesive, it pulled some of the paint, so that took a bunch of sanding to get out. But it's only down to primer, you know, one of the layers of factory primer, so I left that alone. And of course it'll go back. When I go to the front one here, back to the nose, there's really not, everything else was really in pretty good shape. It was just would be the right front corner a little bit. And I'm really pretty happy with how it came out. Hopefully when I get color on it, it'll look as good as it does now. I've done a lot of sanding and blending on there. And you can see a couple spots here where I've had a couple layers of primer on there, and not all the primer was exactly the same color. So you can kind of see, but it's nice and smooth now. Which is kind of a trick, you know, you're trying to get it smooth on a curve and then come up here and make that break square. On the chin spoiler, it had hit something here, and it had cracks emanating out both ways. So I sanded that down to the substrate again in here and here, and got that sanded, smoothed, primed. I also went along the bottom. There were a lot of places where it scuffed the ground, and so that's why that's primed. I just smoothed it all good. This corner had some cracks, and again it's nicely smoothed out, and I think I've got it pretty darn well blended. I guess we're going to find out when I get the paint on it, but it feels good, and it looked good when it was wet. The real challenge with this spoiler is, or lower fascia, is that it's so limber, it's hard to find a way to set it up and get it to stay. So I need to paint underneath the edges all the way along here. And I also need to paint up to the top edge. So there's no good way to support the part so that you can paint it without it. You know, if you just set it on the board, you can't paint. So you can see I've got a couple of 2x6s here. And what I did is I cut some blocks of 2x4, and they're essentially toe-nailed with deck screws, so they can't fall or they can't move. So I'm supporting it here in the corner, and I'm supporting it here in the back. And the same thing is true over on the other side. And then in the middle, I did one more 2x4, just happened to be about enough to just give this a little bit of support out here in the front so that it wouldn't sag. I don't think I absolutely had to do that, but it seemed to be a good thing. So at this point, I think I'm pretty well ready to go. What I need to do next is I will wipe these down again with water, with Windex, window cleaner, some little ammonia, and wipe them down good. And then I'll come back, wipe them with the prep solvent, make sure that there isn't any oil on them. Well, there shouldn't be, but I've touched them, so there's probably skin oil. And then I'll leave them sit overnight. When I get ready to do it, all that I should have to do to remain is use a tack rag on them, and they should be ready to spray. I'll set up my fan here in the back door, get my little shelter, my little stall here. It should be all set to paint. I also, while I was working on it today, I had to do some sanding on some of this indoors because I did it late at night when it was dark. And so that kind of contaminates the room. So I've gone back and I took everything out, and I have a shop vac with a HEPA filter in it. I went through and I vacuumed this whole place with a high grade vac so that I picked up all the dust and cleaned out everything I could. So it's probably not as critical as doing an entire car. But I don't want to get any dirt in anything, so I'm trying to do this to the same standards I would do if I was doing the rest of the car. So that's all for now. I'm going to go finish my prep, and that'll probably be it for the night.